Matthew 26 again is where we're going to be. And we're, of course, continuing our study of the Gospel of Matthew. And in Matthew, we've made it to Matthew's final section, which is the 7th section as I've outlined everything. And this means we are in chapters 26, 27, and 28. So 3 chapters there at the very end. And in section 7, we see that Jesus, with sovereign humility, is murdered on the cross for the forgiveness of our sins and is resurrected in victory to inherit God's kingdom. And of course, this is the climax of everything we've been reading about in this gospel and the real substance of the gospel story. And as I've always have, I divide these sections into portions, and we're in the second portion of this section right now. And in this portion, we begin to see Christ subjected to humiliation as he is arrested, abandoned, and put on trial. So this is, in a sense, the beginning of his troubles there at the very end. Not so much the physical troubles, but in this case, the emotional or psychological troubles. And I've given you a definition of humiliation that I have in mind as I talk about the humiliation of Christ. And it means to be treated worse than you deserve, or at least worse than you think you deserve, to the point that it causes you great sorrow and shame. So the two great components of humiliation, I think, are sorrow and shame, and it has to do with how other people are treating you, and at least your perspective on how you ought to be treated. Now, for Christ, his perspective of himself is accurate, always, which isn't always the case with us, but with him, any wrong done to him is going to be a humiliation, and that is what he's experiencing at this point in Matthew's gospel. Now, in our journey through these humiliating moments before the crucifixion, we have come to Matthew 26, verse 47, and I'm going to be reading verses 47 through 50, so just a few verses this morning. This brings us to the actual arrest of Jesus, so where they actually come to get him. And in this case, focusing more on the first part of things, but Matthew 26, verses 47 through 50, we'll read those now. So he had been speaking to his disciples, so we're kind of coming in after that. While he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, came up accompanied by a large crowd with swords and clubs, who came from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now he who was betraying him gave them a sign, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one, seize him." Immediately Judas went up to Jesus and said, "Hail, Rabbi," and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you have come for." And they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. All right, and there's more that happens there right at that moment, but we're not going to concern ourselves with that today. We're going to focus primarily on those 4 verses that I just read. And of course, the betrayal of Jesus by Judas is the most notable idea in that passage, and it's what most of us probably think of first when we think of the actual arrest of Jesus, the fact that he's betrayed by one of his disciples at this point. And we'll study everything else that happens in that garden that night later on as I teach through Matthew. But again, for today, we're pretty much focusing on Judas. And we're focusing on the betrayal as part of the humiliation suffered by Jesus at this time. So Judas's role in really just bringing Christ low as he kind of continues his descent down into the difficulties of the crucifixion. My sermon today is called Embracing the Betrayal, which I think is fitting given the fact that Jesus is accepting of all of this. He has already, in a sense, wrestled with God in prayer in the garden and is ready to die and ready to experience all these things. And he's known about Judas for a while, so he's ready to go. So he's embracing this betrayal as it happens. And today I want to try to explain the events of the betrayal, but also give attention to the attitude of Jesus during the betrayal as part of showing just how he deals with this humiliation and how it gets, I guess you could say, filtered through his purposes and what he's trying to do for the kingdom of God at this time. My outline today has 3 headings. So I will recite those to you now so you can kind of keep pace with how I'm moving through all of this. First, I will spend some time explaining the scenery and strategy for the arrest of Jesus, or as I will define it later, the place, the posse, and the plan, everything that's happening there at that moment. And I'll explain all those things when I get there. Most of that is just me making sure that you understand what's all happening and what you would see as you look around you at that time. So this is kind of like the real down-to-earth, play-by-play sort of thing. Secondly, I'll talk about the humiliation of Jesus by Judas's betrayal. So coming specifically to that, and I think in particular, the kiss as a humiliating aspect of this event. I really plan to zero in on that. So that'll be the second thing I do. And then finally, I want us to consider how Jesus responds to Judas. And here I have in mind in particular his words to Judas. So at least as the NASB translated, friend, do what you have come for. Or I know different translations say slightly different things, and we'll deal with that when we get there. But Jesus' words to Judas in particular as his response to this betrayal and the humiliation of that moment. Now, as I think about Jesus and his frame of mind on that evening, I think it must have been a combination of a few feelings. And of course, I've already hinted at this by talking about humiliation. But certainly one of those feelings is the deep anguish of betrayal itself, the deep sorrow that people very often feel whenever they themselves are betrayed by someone whom they loved and trusted. Whether that is a familiar feeling for any of you and how deep that feeling is, that all depends on your personal history. I don't know for sure that any of us have necessarily encountered something like that. Some of us possibly have. Nonetheless, if you have experienced it, you'll be all the more able to see this from Jesus' perspective as we go through this passage. The second emotion felt by Jesus at that time might be called dread. And I think I've narrowed down on that word in particular to describe part of the feelings of Jesus at this time, dread. And by dread, I mean what we feel as we come closer and closer to some terrible event which we have known about for a while, but it is only now going to happen. This is the kind of thing where you knew this was going to happen, and maybe in your own mind you just tried not to think about it. Maybe you just tried to say, it's not coming for some time now, but it gets closer and closer because time marches on, and now you are there. And it's time for the deep breath before the plunge as you finally experience this thing you've been dreading for so long. That has got to be part of what Jesus has been feeling as this has drawn near, and now it has come, and he's in the middle of that dread. In the case of Jesus, we might think that the sting of his betrayal by Judas was lessened somewhat by the fact that he knew it was coming. And he's talked about this. I mean, this is not necessarily taking him by surprise. And we might think, therefore, maybe it doesn't sting as badly for him to experience this. But whatever relief Jesus had from his foreknowledge, that space would have been filled by dread as the day came closer and closer for one of his closest friends to actually betray him. And you see, that's how dread works. Of course you know it's coming. That's part of the dread. That's why you're dreading it. And so Jesus is experiencing that and has been and now is very much in the center of what has been coming for a long time now. And now it's time to begin drinking that cup, to use his expression. I say all of that to indicate what opportunity we have to learn from this passage, because again, Christ is our example, and we always come to these passages hoping to, in some sense, imitate him as he does things. Since we ourselves are likely to feel either betrayal or dread or both, we may be helped to know how Jesus confronted those painful feelings and in some way model our behavior off of him. And I hope that is what we will get today, just as we follow him on his road to the cross. So that's what I'm trying to do anyway, as we go through this passage here in Matthew. So let's begin with the first of three main goals that I have for today as we talk about this passage. This is a bit of a minor concern. I don't by any means consider this a major part of the passage, but I do want to spend some time on the scenery and the strategy for the arrest of Jesus. because this is, after all, the background of everything we are studying today. So I want to make sure we have a good foundation as we go through with the rest of this sermon. And we do often ask questions of this kind about minor details. I know that at least some of you ask those questions, so I might as well put it in the sermon and deal with those things up front. So I want to dedicate some time to those before moving into our real point for today. So let's talk about the place, the posse, and the plan. These three things here in this first major heading of the sermon. So let's remember the place where this happened, the Garden of Gethsemane. And I spoke about this some time ago, so I just want to review these points. This might have been, goodness, probably a few sermons ago, maybe it was last sermon, I can't even now remember, but I did talk about just where the Garden of Gethsemane was and how we know that and how we know it's a garden, how we know it's called Gethsemane, and all those things. But this is a place outside of Jerusalem, just outside of Jerusalem. Basically, you come out of the city, you walk through a ravine, and you come back up the other side, and you're coming up onto the Mount of Olives. And on the Mount of Olives, there is a garden called Gethsemane, which means oil press. That's the meaning of it, and gives you an idea of maybe what goes on at this place where they are. They're pressing olives into oil. And in those days, of course, gardens were usually surrounded by walls. So we have this is a bit more like a structure. This isn't just a place where, little plants are planted. This is actually a concerted effort to actually build a place where you can plant these things. And inside there's going to be fruit trees and things like that growing, not just to harvest food, but for appearance. So it is meant to be a very scenic place. It's meant to be a pleasing, a beautiful place. And they're kind of much more like city parks is the analogy that I've often used with you to describe what these ancient gardens were like. They're more like city parks. You go there to hang out and relax and take in the view. That's what these gardens are like. Now, this garden is, of course, outside of Jerusalem, and it's nighttime. Let's not forget what time of day we're talking about. This is night. So no one else is likely to be out there. So this has become now a quiet and secluded place. Quite possibly that's why Jesus had it on his mind to be there. But for the enemies of Jesus, that kind of works a bit of a different way. The advantage of this place is that it allows them to do this kind of away from the crowds and in a place that maybe won't be noticed immediately. You got to remember, this was a concern they had. If we just back up to earlier in Matthew 26, verses 4 through 5, we see how they were hoping this would go. It says, they plotted together to seize Jesus by stealth and kill him, but they were saying, not during the festival, otherwise a riot might occur among the people. Now, they're still kind of in the festival of unleavened bread and Passover and all of that. There's still a lot of people around. But in this case, you can see that they want to do this in a way that won't start a riot among any supporters Jesus might have that are loyal enough to actually riot. Arresting him in the middle of night in this kind of secluded garden where probably no one else is around, that works really well for them. And remember, this is a walled garden, so they're not easily going to be able to escape, right? And not that Jesus is planning to escape, but they don't know that. The enemies of Jesus don't know that. So hey, if Jesus has come away into a secluded place where he's walled in, we got him. That's the whole idea. That's the first aspect of their strategy with this. So from their perspective, this works really well to arrest Jesus. So just thinking about this from their perspective, that's probably part of what's on their mind. Now, speaking of the crowd coming to arrest Jesus, let's talk about them. And from now on, I shall refer to this crowd as a posse, because you should never pass up an opportunity to use the word posse. And for those of you that have never seen a Western a day in your life, a posse is a group of people that get together to arrest a criminal. So if you've not watched the right movies, that's what a posse is. So I'm calling them a posse. That is, however, a Latin word, so it's more sophisticated than you might think. Anyway, a posse. Now, as we think about the people coming out here to arrest Jesus, the posse, right? If you look at all four Gospels and put them all together, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we will find that this posse is formed from many different kinds of people. And you put all the pieces together, you see quite a crowd there. There are actually some of the chief priests themselves are present. Some of the elders are there, who are also on the Sanhedrin High Council of the Jews. There are also servants of those men who are there naturally. And alongside them, people are sent from the scribes and Pharisees, who are therefore also represented here. There are officers from the temple guard that are mentioned to be present. There are some Roman soldiers present, so they're getting a hand in this too. And there's even apparently a Roman commander there, so a Roman officer there. This is quite a group of people, and maybe people that wouldn't normally be hanging out together, but everyone seems to have an interest in coming to arrest this Jesus fellow, and they're all going to be there to make sure it happens. Anybody who is anybody, it seems, was there to make sure Jesus would be arrested. And again, you get that by combining all four Gospels. They all relate this a little bit differently in terms of who was there. Very natural for them. They're all focusing on their own details, and so putting it all together, that's who is there. But if we narrow our focus to what Matthew records, he only says that some men are there from the chief priests and the elders. So that's it. That is as much detail as Matthew gives. He doesn't want you, apparently, to think about any of the other men who might have been there. It's just some men who are from the chief priests and the elders. Not even the leaders of the Jews themselves, just men that they sent along. So as you picture these things as Matthew wrote it, it's actually very limited. It's almost as though Matthew does not want to dignify the presence of any of the Jewish leaders at that time, as some of the other Gospels do. Luke's Gospel, for example, mentions those men being there. Apparently some of the higher-ups in the Jewish government wanted to make sure this went down correctly, and were there personally to make sure of it. But in Matthew's Gospel, none of that. It's just some servants that were sent out to go and do this thing here. So Matthew only mentions the lackeys of those men, the people that are very much their servants. And I think that's fair, and that's probably Matthew's attempt to maybe take away some of their pride or dignity as he relates this, or maybe just to imply that they're not important enough to be mentioned there at this time. Maybe that's Matthew's way of keeping all eyes on Jesus as the most illustrious person there. All of that could be what's going through his mind. I just thought it was a notable detail. I like to pay attention to what different Gospels do differently and try to see maybe what they were thinking about that as they were writing their stuff. So that's just my suggestion on maybe why Matthew related it that way. But that's as much as I have to say about the posse in particular coming out to arrest Jesus. Now let's talk about their plan, and especially related to this kiss that Judas decides to use as a sign. Let's talk about what their actual strategy is. We've talked about part of it, arresting him in this secluded place where he's kind of walled in, but let's talk about more. Now in the passage, Judas said that he would kiss Jesus as a signal for which man they should arrest, right? That's his whole thing. Like, the man that I kiss, that's him, seize him. That's the plan. Now, if you're like me and you sit here and you think about these details and try to figure out what's going on, you might be wondering why a signal was even necessary. Why do that? Jesus was a public figure, often speaking in the very temple itself. He's been in Jerusalem, and very publicly in Jerusalem, for like a week now. I mean, surely somebody there knows what Jesus looks like, right? What's the need to identify him positively? I mean, has everyone just kind of forgotten what their main target looks like? What's going on? Why do we need Judas there to pinpoint exactly who Jesus is in the middle of that crowd? Well, we need to remember it was dark, okay? It was nighttime. And back then they didn't have tactical flashlights or anything like that they could use to illuminate things. They had torches and lanterns. I don't know if you've ever used anything like that, but they don't really show any detail unless you get right up on a person, like hold the lantern right up in their face and see, who are you? It's like, they're not that good compared to the stuff that we have now. Now we've got stuff that can blind people with light if we wanted to. So they don't have the ability to see well enough to see who they need to arrest. So they need someone who can get right up there in the group without arousing suspicion, and who can do something visible from a distance to indicate who they need to arrest. And Judas's idea is to greet Jesus with a kiss to that purpose. But that, as we talk about that, kind of raises another question. Why the need for that precision? Why the need to identify Jesus in particular? Why not just arrest everyone there? Jesus and the disciples. Aren't they all kind of troublemakers? Aren't the disciples with him? Why be that precise about it? Why not just go in there, bonk everybody on the head and sort it out later? Why not do that? They've got them enclosed, right? There's a wall here. If they block the exits, no one's getting out. Why not just do that? Why go straight for Jesus and try to get him first? What's the idea with that? Well, the thing is, if you know anything about crowd control, something that they teach you in like a police context or a military context, if you want to just disable a whole group of people, you've got to take out the leader first. Because we have this, people are kind of weird. Whenever we're following someone, we feel like confident, like we know what we're doing. If that guy goes down, we're all like we just don't know what to do. In self-defense classes, they teach you if you ever get accosted by a gang of people, hit the leader in the nose as hard as you can and then run, because his lackeys won't know what to do. They'll just be stunned by it. And there are plenty of stories evidencing that. So it's something that works, right? So you're going in there, you've got a crowd of people, Jesus with his disciples. You don't really know what's going to happen. At least one of those guys is ready for a fight, because we know what Peter does later. But they want to make sure that they do this in the slickest way possible. So they want to make sure, I think, to get Jesus first, control him, and hopefully the disciples will just lay down peacefully. Peter has other plans, but they don't know that necessarily. So I think that is what they're thinking, though, why they want to make a point to get hands on Jesus first and as quickly as possible. It's just a measure of crowd control. I think that's the only reason for that, why they really want to make sure they get him precisely first. So with all that in mind, what exactly is their plan overall? Well, I think it went something like this. First, this posse of people waits to hear from Judas that Jesus and the other disciples were entering that walled garden. They have their informant to let them know when they're heading out in that direction. Second, the posse would all enter the garden where they think it will be easier to make a quick private arrest. All right, so they wait for them to enter this enclosed area away from the city so that they can do this without causing a riot. And third, I imagine that they all move into position kind of around the group as quietly as possible for what they think will be an ambush. Of course, Jesus knows this is going to happen, but they don't know that he knows that. So they're probably trying to take up positions where they can move quickly, out of cover whenever they see that signal from Judas. And then, of course, they send in Judas to kiss Jesus as the signal. And then when they see that, they finally pounce. And of course, from the moment Judas appears, Jesus displays who is actually in control of the situation, because he speaks as though he knows what's happening, and of course he does. So the arrest is not nearly as neat as they would want it to be, but I think they did have a plan going in there, and as I analyze the parts of it, it seems to work decently well. The last comment to make about their strategy is this. Why did Judas choose a kiss in particular? Why that? Why was that chosen as his signal to the rest of the posse that this is Jesus, this is the guy you want to arrest? Now, although it may seem strange to us, a kiss was actually a very common greeting at that time. I think in our time and place, we're a little more selective with who we kiss, if anybody. But back then, it was much more common to just greet people with a kiss. So from the time just after Jesus, we have the exhortation by Paul in one of his letters, greet one another with a holy kiss. That's 2 Corinthians 13:12, by the way. It shows you that that's just the way you greet people, right? Greet one another with a holy kiss. I think today we translate it culturally anyway, as like a hearty handshake or something, because we normally do that. That's our greeting. But back then, it's a kiss. That's how you greet people. Also, something said by Jesus himself in another passage, you don't necessarily have to go there, but I thought I would read from Luke chapter 7. This is the incident when the woman anointed the feet of Jesus in the house of Simon the Pharisee, and then Jesus gets to commenting on all of that, and he says something that shows you just how common the kiss was as a greeting at that time. This is Luke 7:44 through 45. So turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but she, since the time I came in, has not ceased to kiss my feet." And of course, he goes on from there. But the way Jesus words that, he assumes that when he comes in the door of Simon the Pharisee, Simon should have greeted him with a kiss, and he didn't. Probably because the Pharisees don't like Jesus, and they didn't give him the traditional greeting that would be expected. But that just goes to show again, how common it was to use the kiss as a greeting. So why would Judas choose a kiss for the signal? Because no one would think it's strange at all. It makes it perfect for an ambush then. If he wants to go in there and act like everything's normal and not tip off the disciples to what's about to happen, walk up in there, say, "Hail, Rabbi," and kiss him on the cheek, and no one will think anything of it, except Jesus, who knows this is happening. But no one else will see, no one else will even think that Judas is up to anything in particular. It just looks like a typical greeting. So that is all I had to say about the scenery and strategy, so the place, the posse, and the plan at that time. Now, with all that out of the way, let's talk about the humiliation of Jesus by Judas and how the actions of Judas actually contribute to the overall shame and sorrow of Christ as he begins to experience these things leading to his death. As I said at the beginning, being humiliated means being treated worse than you deserve, or at least worse than you think you deserve, to the point that it causes you great sorrow and shame. So that's my definition. So sorrow and shame, very big parts of that. On the one hand, I've already commented on the likely emotions of Jesus at this time, the great anguish of betrayal, and the dread of watching a terrible, unstoppable calamity just come closer and closer to you until you can't get away from it. All of that, I think, is there. But what about the shame? I haven't really said anything about that yet, the feeling of shame. We tend to think of shame, I think, probably more than anything else when we think about humiliation. In fact, we probably use those words in just everyday speech to mean the same thing, roughly. If you say, "I'm ashamed," you mean roughly the same thing as "I was humiliated." All of that is probably very closely bound in our mind. But I haven't really commented yet on how Jesus might feel shame on account of what Judas has done to him at this time. So as part of that, as part of showing you that, I want to read 3 passages of Scripture for you. So if you're taking good outline notes on what I'm doing here, this heading has 3 subpoints, one for each passage I'm about to read to you. So I want to do these 3 passages here because I think they might have been on the mind of Jesus at this time. And with that, I'm assuming that Jesus is a biblically literate person, which he is, and that he is always acting in accordance with such things as are revealed in the will of God. And so I think these passages might be on his mind, and they might inform for us a little bit as to what was on the mind of Jesus and how these things contribute to his overall feeling of shame as he undergoes this mistreatment. So let's begin with a story not often quoted in sermons, but which features another earlier kiss of betrayal. All right? You might think, no one else in history was betrayed with a kiss, but actually there's someone in the Old Testament that was betrayed with a kiss. This account is from 2 Samuel chapter 20, and you can turn there if you like. That's 2 Samuel verse 20. 2 Samuel chapter 20 verse, I messed myself up. 2 Samuel chapter 20, start in verse 7, and I'll read through verse 11. There you go, 2 Samuel chapter 20. Sorry about that. Let me give you some context for what's happening here. I'm just going to summarize what's broadly happening at this time. At this time, King David is fighting against a revolt led by a man named Sheba. This is Sheba's revolt. This is just after Absalom's revolt, by the way. So busy times for David. Now, normally, the man in charge of David's army would be a guy named Joab, who is rather infamous in Scripture for sometimes being a loose cannon. Now, Joab, however, has made some trouble for himself and has been demoted. He is no longer in charge of the army. And David has appointed another man to be in charge of the army named Amasa. Now, here's the problem. Amasa is a doofus. And I say that in Christian love. I mean, the guy is not smart. He causes some trouble of his own as they're gearing up to fight this revolt. And he's not on top of things. And he's certainly not the equal of a guy like Joab, who is very calculating and very driven and a very popular general. Joab knows that even if he's fallen out of favor with David, the army is probably still with him. And Joab is not going to let some doofus slow him down. So with that in mind, let's read this passage. Joab, as it turns out, wants his old job back, and he's going to get it back by any means necessary. So let's read this. This is 2 Samuel chapter 20, starting in verse 7. Yeah, here we are. So Joab's men went out after him, along with the Kerethites and the Pelethites and all the mighty men, and they went out from Jerusalem to pursue Sheba the son of Bichri. And when they were at the large stone which is in Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them. Now Joab was dressed in his military attire, and over it was a belt, with a sword in its sheath fastened at his waist. And as he went forward, it fell out. Joab said to Amasa, "Is it well with you, my brother?" And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. But Amasa was not on guard against the sword which was in Joab's hand. So he struck him in the belly with it. Yikes. And he did not strike him again, and he died. Then Joab and Abishai his brother pursued Sheba the son of Bichri. Now there stood by him one of Joab's young men and said, "Whoever favors Joab, and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab." And from there, they all follow Joab. Like, no one really cares that Amasa was just murdered in cold blood right there. Like, their general was killed and nobody cared. Joab just takes over. Now, I read you that story, as interesting as it is in itself, to indicate that Judas was not the first man to betray somebody with a kiss. As Joab comes up to Amasa, he pretends to give him a very traditional greeting, even a very warm greeting. "Is it well with you, my brother?" And just stabs him. That's it. I mean, he does the deed himself. So Judas wasn't the first guy to do this. Now, the other thing about this is that you got to realize, as I said, the guy who gets betrayed by the kiss is not very bright. He really comes across looking like an absolute moron in this story. It's like, did you not think that a guy like Joab might have a grudge against you? And did it not seem odd to you that his sword fell out right before he got up to you? Seriously, man, how did you become a general? Like, how did you make it to this rank? It doesn't make any sense. But here's the problem. Jesus is now filling the role of Amasa. Like, he's the doofus being betrayed now by a kiss. Like, from now on, when people think about, people who got betrayed by a kiss, they're going to think about the idiot Amasa and Jesus. Like, Jesus is stepping into that role as he comes to this point with Judas here. If I were about to die in some way that implied that I was a doofus like Amasa, I don't think sorrow would be my chief emotion. I think shame would be my chief emotion. I think I would feel just incredibly embarrassed to die like that. And I think Jesus, being knowledgeable of history and scripture, probably had thoughts like that. He's like, this is how it's going to go down. I'm going to die like this guy, of all people. It's like that had to be a bit of a pang of shame there as Judas approaches him to kiss him. So there's one passage that I think maybe informs what might be on Jesus' mind and heart as this goes down. But I have another passage for you about a kiss that might have been on Jesus' mind. This one is a proverb. So this is going to be Proverbs 27, verse 6, if you want to go there. We're not going to be there long, but if you want to go there, that's the next one. Proverbs 27, verse 6. Now, in this case, there's no context to discuss, so we can just read the proverb. The Proverbs usually don't have a context, so let's just read the proverb. Proverbs 27, verse 6, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy." So there's the proverb. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. So the meaning is your friends, they might, say things or do things that seem harmful, but really they're still looking out for your best interest. love hurts sometimes, but your friends are your friends nonetheless. But the deceitful people, I mean, when it looks like they're doing something good for you, they are not. You got to watch out for those guys. So deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. Now, if I had to gamble, I would say that most people read that proverb and think of Judas immediately. Living on this side of things, living on this side of the cross, I think if most people hear that, they're going to say like Judas, right? That's probably where their mind goes first. However, people were reading and reciting this proverb long before Judas lived and betrayed Jesus. There was a time when you read this proverb and you didn't think of Judas. I mean, who's Judas? There's probably a million people named Judas, actually, in that time and place. So it's just you're not thinking of anyone in particular. It's just a proverb. Deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. And yet Jesus himself, no doubt, knew this proverb. This was probably something that he, like any God-fearing Jew at the time, would try to commit to memory, and Jesus more so, being the Son of God and being, preaching for all this time and being the Messiah, this is going to be on his mind. And I think Jesus also knew, because Jesus is very wise like this, he knows how people's brains work. He knows the connections that people tend to make between events and statements and other kinds of things. And he knows that people love to create these kind of cautionary tales around victims who meet very tragic deaths. Anytime somebody suffers some calamity that's very unique and distinguished, people like to say, oh, you don't want to be like so-and-so, do you? That's just how people's minds work. And Jesus knows that. With all that in mind, I think it's fair to say that Jesus knew he was about to become a cautionary tale. He was about to become the guy you think of, along with his betrayer, when you read this proverb. He knows that you're probably going to make him go down in history in this way. Jesus knew that people would read this proverb from then on and say, oh, it's like Judas and Jesus, right? Deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. I think Jesus knows his name is about to be hung on this proverb next to Judas as someone that got deceived in a very terrible way. To this day, we speak of the Judas kiss as a figure of speech for something that seems generous, but is actually very hurtful. It's don't be betrayed by a kiss, watch out. And Jesus is part of that. And I think some part of Jesus must have grown within him to think of meeting his death at the end of a kiss and kind of filling out this particular proverb with a meaning that would have been terrible for anyone to have, but especially him, who did nothing wrong. Nothing wrong at all. I think Jesus groaned to become a cautionary tale in the way that he has become, in a sense, a cautionary tale. But I've saved the worst for last. I have one more passage, and I've saved this one to the very end. This is Psalm chapter 2, or Psalm 2. It's not really chapter 2. Psalm 2, right? And I'm going to read this to you. I'm going to read it from the ESV, actually, because they give a more literal translation of the verse I actually want to read from this, but I want us to kind of feel it, so let's read the whole psalm. It's not very long. It's 12 verses. So this, of course, is one of the more well-known messianic psalms. So a psalm about the coming king, Jesus. All right, here we go. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, his Messiah, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like potter's vessel. We'll stop there for a moment. Here we have a very exalted picture of the Messiah. All the nations and all the peoples plotting against him. Doesn't matter. God set him up. He's going to be king. He's going to thrash the whole world if he needs to. Very exalted view of the Messiah. So what's the application of this? Now therefore, O kings, be wise, and be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way. For soon his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. The entire psalm is about the unstoppable rule of the Messiah, this king who is going to be over everything. Even if the whole world is against him, he is going to conquer. And by the end of the psalm, all nations and rulers are threatened with death if they will not submit to the Son of God. Again, this is a huge power trip. This is like really painting the Messiah as big and bad and powerful, and no one's going to stand against him. They are specifically commanded to kiss the Son, lest they become angry at their rebellion. We kind of have the image from days past where when you approach a king or something like that, you might kiss the ring on his finger, you might kiss his feet, something like that. You're supposed to do homage, which I think is how the NASB translates it. But you do that by this kind of ceremonial kiss. So this is, in a sense, kissing the Son is part of paying homage to the Messiah. But in Gethsemane, the Son of God is received with a kiss for sure. Judas does kiss him, but rather than paying homage, it was part of an assassination attempt. Like this whole imagery that is meant to be Jesus' great future as the King of Kings. This whole idea of kissing the Son gets commandeered into the way he's going to die. And Jesus surely had this on his mind. Psalm 2 is a messianic psalm. As he thought about himself, who he was, and where he was eventually going, what God was eventually going to do for him, this is one of the things that he would be having in his mind. But here and now, part of that gets just wrongly applied to the situation, to where the king is not being honored with a kiss, but betrayed by one. Jesus is going to assert in the following verses that he could call down 12 legions of angels to defend him if he really wanted to, and he certainly had that power. And someday Jesus will call down those angels. That's where this is going with the second coming. But that night, Jesus had to receive a traitorous kiss and soon die in disgrace, even though it was his future, his destiny, to receive these kisses of homage from the entire world, people trembling before him. But here and now, he's getting betrayed by a kiss instead. And I bring that up to again talk about just the feeling of shame and humiliation that Christ probably felt at this time. All this mixture of things, a very real sense in which everything is going wrong. Yes, it's a part of the plan, but this is the plan. This is the part of the plan where sinners have their way with the Messiah. And it is awful. And Jesus just has to take it. He has to take it all right in the face, just bang, and just endure it. All of that to say, the humiliation of Jesus continues through this and is going to continue on into other things too. But with Judas being there and betraying him in this way, humiliation is certainly a part of it as he feels his way through these things. Well, here at the end, I want to spend some time on how Jesus responds to Judas during this betrayal. So how Jesus actually acts toward his betrayer at this time. And hopefully we can draw upon his example in any similar situations we might face. And again, that's my hope for this, that Christ will be our example, that we will imitate him insofar as we ever experience some kind of betrayal or humiliation, even remotely like this, that we will make Christ our example. Well, I have two observations to make about the response of Jesus, and they both come from the words he says to Judas at this time. And this first one, you're going to wonder where I'm getting this, but as always, I plan to break these things down for you. I tried really hard to get the right statement for this. First, Jesus spoke truth against sin with pointed mercy. So Jesus spoke truth against sin with pointed mercy. Now, I want to talk about this by talking about the first word that comes out of Jesus' mouth when he talks to Judas. And that word is friend. That's the first thing he says to him, right? If we go back to verse 50, and Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you have come for." So he leads off with that word. Now, when talking about this word, friend, we need to acknowledge something, that humans tend to classify and rank their friends. It's kind of a strange thing to do. It sounds really petty when you think about it too long, but we do this. We distinguish between friends and acquaintances. You say, oh, is he your friend? Oh, he's an acquaintance. Kind kind of a slight to that guy, I guess, in some way, but friends and acquaintances, right? We distinguish between friends and friends on Facebook, which is a very new thing. But hey, people do that. Oh, we're friends on Facebook, but not in real life. We're just friends on Facebook. We have the idea of a best friend, and we have the idea of a frenemy, someone who is both your friend and your enemy, which sounds really complicated. I'm glad I don't have any of those. But nonetheless, we have all these different ranks and classifications for friends. It sounds really weird, but it actually happens. And in fact, in certain languages, this kind of gets encoded. And in Greek, the language being used by Matthew, it's that way. This word being used here, friend, has some meaning as we think about it. So let's talk about Greek words for friend. How did the Greeks and the people that use the Greek language classify their friends? Well, there are two primary words for friend that they had. One is philos, and the other is heteros. So philos, heteros. Now, of the two, we might call philos the more heartfelt word. It literally means beloved. When you use this word for friend, you're saying this is someone I love. This is a beloved person, philos. Okay? Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. It's the same root, philos. And on that note, Jesus referred to his disciples as his friends using this word, philos, earlier this evening. So before they come to the garden, when they're still talking around the table and that kind of scene, Jesus refers to his disciples as his friends using this word. Just briefly here from John 15:15. He says, "No longer do I call you slaves or servants, for the slave does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends." So, beloved, philos. "For all the things that I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you." All right? So Jesus referred to his disciples as philos, beloved friends. However, Jesus does not call Judas philos. He doesn't use that word in this passage in Matthew. Jesus calls Judas heteros, the other word for friend. Now, the word heteros is more literally someone who shares an experience with you. So that's kind of the definition that they usually give for that. As for translating that, people have proposed words like partner, comrade, companion, those kinds of words to describe this, not necessarily as warm a word as beloved. Whenever you refer to your coworkers as your friends, you probably mean heteros, to be honest with you. That's probably what that means whenever you say those kinds of things. And that is how Jesus greets Judas, heteros. That's the word he uses. And in calling Judas heteros, there's a lot of meaning there. And I spent some time just thinking about how would that land on Judas? What might Jesus mean as he speaks that word on this time? And there's actually a lot there. First, in calling Judas heteros, Jesus speaks the truth. It is an accurate description of what Judas has been for him. These two have shared many experiences over the past 3 years. I mean, Judas was just a part of the disciples. No one ever thought anything was weird about Judas. He was just right there with the rest of them. They've shared many experiences together, and they're about to share another of a very different sort. But it's true, heteros, partner, companion, comrade, it all fits. Furthermore, this truth confronts sin. When Judas became a traitor, he lost the man who might have been his best possible friend. Jesus would have been the one guy you want in your life, right? And Judas lost that. And Jesus lets him know he lost that. A few hours earlier, he might have called him philos. Now, heteros. You've been demoted. You're no longer in this group of people whom I call beloved. You're now just some guy I know. You're an acquaintance. Very much a confrontation of how much Judas has lost by his sin. Jesus lets him know that, just with the wording he uses. Now, I imagine that word landed with some weight on Judas. And yet the word heteros is not without mercy, to call him that. I think if I were being betrayed by someone I trusted, I might have some other choice words I would call them. And none of them would be the word friend, acquaintance, any of that. I wouldn't have used any words like that. But Christ responds peacefully. He responds in a way that is without ire, without hatred, without anger, without any of that. He just calls him friend, heteros. And that's why I say in this one word, Jesus spoke truth against sin with appointed mercy. I'm sure to some degree it hurt Judas when he heard that particular word applied to him, but it was the kind of hurt where you're, I guess as we say, we're killing someone with kindness, where you know you don't deserve what little kindness you're getting out of this person, but they're being kind to you anyway. I feel like all of that landed on Judas in that moment. So Jesus, as always, very good with his words and choosing the right word for the right occasion. That's the first way Jesus responds to Judas, just with this word, friend, that he calls him. The other observation to make comes from the rest of what Jesus says to Judas. And the grammar of Matthew's Greek is kind of odd here. And the result of that is if you're comparing translations, you're going to see some different wording as you compare things. So I'm going to talk about both of them because both of them are full of meaning. And as I was looking at it, I didn't feel like I could come down on the side of which one is right or best. So I'm just going to talk about both of them. And you know what? Both of them have meaning. So we'll go with both of them. Why not? So modern translations, at least, usually give this wording as a command. And it's usually something like, do what you came to do. Or I think the NASB says, do what you came here for, or something like that. So friend, do what you came to do. Modern Bible translations usually take it as a command. And if that is what Jesus meant, then he is, in fact, looking past Judas to the will of God. Because after all, all of this is happening in the will of God, and Jesus just says, you know what, Judas? Do what you came here to do. It's all part of the plan. And of course, Jesus knows God's plan, that this is betrayal and death he's facing here. He knows where this is heading. And Jesus always submits to God's will, no matter how hard it is. And he's submitting to God in this. So Christ spares very little thought for the sin being committed against him and doesn't really throw up any defenses, doesn't try to get away at the last minute. He just says, you know what, Judas, friend, do what you came here to do. Just hit me. Let's do this. Let's get it over with. And this, I think, is a very strong reminder to us about the fitness of entrusting ourselves to God, even when everything seems against us. It's like, you know what? If God brought me here to this place, if this is what God wants me to do here and now, if this is the kind of trouble that God wants me to endure right now for some reason, let's do it. Do what you came to do. Let's just embrace it and move on. But that, of course, is just one possibility. Older translations, like I think the King James Version does this, they tend to translate it as a question. And the question is, what did you come here to do? Right? So instead of do what you came here to do, it's what did you come here to do? So older translations usually translate it as a question. Now, as I read that, I cannot help but think of another time in another garden where somebody asked a question of a sinner. When Adam sinned, God came and said, where are you? Even though he knew where Adam was and why he was hiding, by then Adam and Eve had both eaten from the tree of knowledge, which they were not supposed to eat from, and God shows up and says, where are you? Like, as though he needs any help, right? I mean, he knows where they are and he knows why they're hiding. But that question is meant to prompt them to begin to just confess what they've done and own up to the guilt that they now have. That's God's gentle way of confronting them with what he knows they have done. It seems possible then that Jesus confronted Judas in a similar manner. What did you come here to do? What's this all about, Judas? Do you have anything to say to me? And I have to imagine that Judas's, if that is the way it landed on Judas, his stomach probably fell a few inches. Just to think about what he came there to do, what he was doing, what he had already done by kissing Jesus and giving the signal for these guys to jump out of hiding and just pounce on Jesus. He's like, what have I come here to do? What have I done? It's like that kind of confrontation, the way that is handled, I mean, it's the kind of thing that sticks in a person's conscience. And in Judas's case, it certainly played out that way. I mean, this guy is going to be so regretful of what he had done, he's going to kill himself before too long after this point. And I point that out because it shows that at this time, if this is the way Jesus said this, and it did come across as this kind of this kind of piercing question, if you will. He's addressing himself to the conscience of Judas in the same way that God was addressing himself to the conscience of Adam and Eve back in the garden. And I think it's very important for us to bear that in mind. In these times where maybe someone is sinning against us, they are in the wrong. Even in those moments, we should be looking for ways to address their conscience. And now Jesus, of course, again, is very good with his words and just comes out with these things like they're nothing. But insofar as we can get people to snap out of whatever hatred they have for us, whatever reason they're doing what they're doing to us, get them to step back and just think, what are they doing? What am I doing? Like, why are you doing this to me? It's like trying to get them to think about these things and address yourself to their conscience. I feel like that's very important to remember because in those moments we're probably more likely to be thinking about ourselves. But insofar as we can make sinners think about what they are doing and why they are doing it, that is all the better for them. That might be the beginning of actual repentance. In Judas's case, it didn't turn out that way. He was the son of perdition. He just killed himself. And after that, he endures the judgment of God to this day. But hopefully in other people, it might turn out otherwise. All right, well, I talk about all of that again just to show you how Jesus responded immediately right there in that moment to Judas, his own betrayal, and the humiliation being worked against him at that time. Now, to me, this all felt like a rather dense message. I felt like there was a lot of things I wanted to say and a lot to kind of cram in here. So let's end with a brief summary, like I always do. I'll try to give a little more detail just to make sure everything is, hung on some part of your brain as we leave this. So first, I spent some time explaining the scenery and strategy for the arrest of Jesus. I talked about the place, Gethsemane, the posse, the crowd of people coming out there, and also the plan, why they've organized this the way they have, why they're doing what they're doing. And that's mainly just to provide you with the logic behind these people coming to arrest Christ, so you can think about it maybe from their perspective and understand what's all going on. Secondly, I spoke about the humiliation of Jesus by Judas's betrayal, here focusing especially on the shame felt by Jesus. And I read you 3 passages which I think might have been on the mind of Jesus, all of them pertaining to kisses, usually in some kind of ironic way, and just showing you how Judas's greeting Jesus with a kiss would have felt as it hit Jesus there, and just the wrongness of this action by Judas at this time, and how Jesus would have felt shame just to endure that at that time. And then finally, I came around to the real point of all of this, Jesus embracing the betrayal, and that's my sermon's title, of course. And I talked about Jesus' words to Judas at this time. And first of all, calling Judas friend. I said that Jesus spoke the truth against sin with very pointed mercy. And that's how I kind of summarized everything that Jesus loaded into that word friend, as he calls Judas his friend at that time. And then finally, we talked about the rest of the statement, which is differently translated. And if it's meant to be read, do what you came here to do, it shows Jesus just fully embracing the will of God at that time. If it's a question, friend, what have you come here to do? It's Jesus' way of kind of pressing the conscience of Judas and make him consider what he's doing as he's doing it. Well, next time we'll press forward to the next few verses in Matthew and see what else happened at the arrest of Jesus, because there's plenty more that happened and we have a lot more to talk about. So we'll do that the next time I preach. Are there any questions or comments about any of this today?